Hello everyone. As part of the course, the next session we'll be speaking on is the issue of conflicts of interest. My name is Anant Bhan. I am a researcher in bioethics, global health and policy, and I will be taking you through this session focusing on why conflicts of interest is important. As you see, the objectives of this session are to identify the types of conflicts of interest which occur, at what levels of research these can occur, what are their potential consequences, and then we can figure out what are the possible or potential methods which can help us minimize their occurrence, especially in the context of being an ethics committee member. So in terms of looking at what conflicts of interest are, the first step is essentially understanding what we are referring to. So a conflict of interest is typically defined as a set of conditions in which your professional judgment concerning your primary interest. So for example, if you are a clinician, then your primary interest is the well-being of your patient. If you are a researcher, then your primary interest is doing quality scientific research. If you are an ethics committee member, then your focus is on participant welfare. So if any of these primary interests are unduly influenced by a secondary interest, which could be financial, non-financial, such as personal, academic or political, then we say that conflict of interest is existing. And we'll come to examples of how this might actually be happening. Now, conflicts of interest tend to be pervasive. They are sort of omnipresent. And there are many kinds of conflicts of interest which exist, and they can exist at all levels of research. Some of these are clearly very obvious, so anyone who's looking at a particular protocol might be able to very quickly pick on this, but many of them are also quite subtle and need a little bit of sort of reflection in being able to pick them up. It's ideal to avoid a situation where there is a conflict of interest, but if that's not possible, you should work on minimizing it. And hence, again, it's really important to be transparent also, as well as ensure accountability in such scenarios. But obviously, to be able to do that, you require adequate forethought and also knowledge beforehand of the kinds of conflicts of interest. So we'll look at some of those in this presentation. So why is it that we worry about the issue of conflicts of interest? Now, what's happened over the last few decades is that there are increasingly a set of partnerships which are existing within the research scenario between industry, academia and even government bodies, and these are in many ways essential for the discovery and development of new medications, new technologies for both prevention, diagnosis as well as treatment of disease. But there are concerns whenever there is this level of partnership which exists with profit-making bodies, for example, like industry. So there are concerns about the undue influence which, for example, profit-making bodies like industry might, they might influence professional judgments, including your primary interests of well-being of research participants or your patients, and they might impact the goals of medicine. And that's why you need to be a little bit cognizant about the possibility of conflicts of interest arising. They might also potentially threaten the integrity and objectivity of scientific investigations, the quality of patient care as part of that, the trust in the field of biomedicine and medicine as well as research. And that's why I think as ethics committee members also, it's equally important for us to worry about some of these things. So why do we need to address conflicts of interest? It's important to address conflicts of interest to minimize the influence of the secondary interests which we talked about, such as personal financial gain, which should be ideally irrelevant to the merits of decisions about your primary interests, such as the care of the patient or the research participant or the conduct of the research protocol. And it's also important because you want to ensure that there is public confidence in professional judgment, either as a clinician or as a researcher or as a research institution, and also public trust in the research enterprise. Because if we lose that, and I think we will push back the field of biomedical research by potentially many, many years if people lose that faith in the biomedical research enterprise. Now, conflict of interest can occur at various levels. It could occur at the level of the individual, say the researcher. It could occur at the level of the ethics committee, especially the members. It could also be institutional, and it could be at the level of sponsors, and each of those levels are important to look at. Now, if you look at the individual level conflict of interest, obviously the most glaring is when you have a clear financial interest in outcome. For example, if I have discovered or invented a new molecule which is now going through a clinical trial procedure, and then I am also the person who's conducting that clinical trial, then I know that if that clinical trial is successful in terms of proving efficacy of that molecule, then I would potentially stand to gain financially a lot of money, because if I could sell that to industry, or I could myself set up an industry, so that is obviously something where I have a clear financial interest in the outcome. Or I could be working on a similar topic and also have an interest in the outcome. For example, I am working in the same area, which is a sub or super specialty, and I know that if that protocol does not clear a review process, then I have the possibility of submitting a similar protocol, and maybe if there is competitive funding, then I would have a higher chance of getting funding if my competitor does not get positive reviews or does not get funded. So I might have a negative interest in ensuring that that person's protocol is not cleared. It might also be the case that I might have an ideological position that views the study negatively or sometimes positively, and that might bias my decision. For example, I might have an ideological position against abortion or against the field of sexuality research, and instead of looking at the merits of the research protocol, I might actually focus on the fact that they are working in an area which I am very uncomfortable with because of my ideological position, and that is the reason why I might give a negative feedback on that protocol, and not based on actually the scientific merit of that protocol. So that again obviously is a clear conflict of interest based on an ideological position that I might have. It might also be the case that I might not be actually directly working on or have an ideological interest in that area, but I might have an interest in the research being undertaken, because that might impact my own professional outcomes. For example, I am the head of the department where the principal investigator is based. I know if that protocol is successfully reviewed and it's brought to the department, and maybe if it is a very large grant, then I also get a positive benefit out of the fact that I might be then, it might then be said that as the head of the department, I brought in a multi-crore grant to the department, or I was the head of the department when so many research protocols were actually approved. So that obviously also is a benefit that I will indirectly gain from that kind of a situation. Now, conflicts of interest can have various implications for research. They can directly actually at the individual level impact both the consent process as well as the review process. And if you look at the consent process, then if I have as an individual a conflict of interest with regards to the research protocol, it might impact the way I administer the consent to the research participant. So if I have a vested interest, I might actually push the research participant into participating, because I want more research participants to participate in that study, so that the study can be completed at a sooner date by having a higher recruitment and retention scenario. But then I am not actually probably giving a balanced scenario as part of the consent process. I am actually, because of my vested interest, focusing on ensuring that that participant agrees to participate, and I might then possibly also hide some information as part of that. So again, there the conflict of interest could impact the consent process. One way of addressing that is to ensure that if there is a conflict of interest at the level of the researcher, then you try to get an independent person or persons, a set of persons, to administer the consent. Obviously, the same requirements would exist as you would have as you know about consenting, which is that the person who is administering the consent should have the confidence and knowledge about the research protocol to be able to defend the protocol and answer any questions, and have adequate knowledge about the research protocol. With that caveat, you would want an independent set of persons to administer the consent. Now, it might also impact your role as a reviewer. So, if you are a scientific peer reviewer and you have a conflict of interest with regards to that protocol, because of you working in that same area, because of you having personal affiliations, for example, you are a spouse of the principal investigator, or you are a close friend of this principal investigator, or you have a past working relationship of multiple projects you have done together with that principal investigator, then that might impact you from giving an unbiased peer review, because your personal affiliation might impact your decision regarding whether you pass that proposal, whether you give your positive feedback or not, or help that proposal pass through. You might also actually have a financial or any other stakeholding in the product being researched on. So I might be an investor, or I might have stocks, or I might have shares in the company on whose product this research protocol is based, and I know that if this product is actually successful, then I also stand to gain financially. So that might also impact my role as a peer reviewer and the independence of my decision making. So again, that's another example to think about. Now, if we look at the conflict of interest in the ethics committee scenario, and all of you are either interested in or are ethics committee members, I think this would be of especially interest to you. As an IC member, you could have a individual conflict of interest with respect to a research protocol, and we have already discussed the multiple mechanisms where that could be true. You could have again a financial interest in the companies which are sponsoring that research protocol or whose product is being researched on. You could have personal or professional relationships with research applicants which might impact your decision making and the independence of that. Or you could have a conflict of interest with respect to your role within the institution, because you are at a senior level within the institution and you want more and more research projects which bring in grant money to come to that institution, and that interest might impact again your independent decision making as a member of the ethics committee. Now, let us take an example. In 1999, the US OHRP, the Office for Human Research Protections, had actually shut down the university, Duke University's IRB, because the grant officer, who is the person who is actually responsible for administering and also processing grants, was also a member of the Institutional Review Board, which is the equivalent of the IC in India. And in normal scenarios should never have been a voting member, but there he or she was actively voting on protocols. And the feeling within the regulatory body, in this case the OHRP, was that there was obviously, this had led to an inadequate supervision from the IRB of all the human subject research which was happening within the university. And that's an example of where, as an institutional a person who holds an institutional post, there is a possibility that you might also have a conflict of interest with regards to the kind of research which happens in the institution. So, why do ethics committees need to focus on this area of conflict of interest? Now, as you all know, the main role of the ethics committee is to ensure protection of the rights and welfare of study participants. Conflicts of interest can cause researchers, ethics committee members, and other relevant stakeholders to make biased decisions, and hence you need to worry about that as an ethics committee member who is wanting to protect the rights and well-being of your study participants in the institution. And it is very important for the institutional ethics committee then to be able to review all these potential conflicts of interest, to figure out if that conflict of interest is leading to a bias, and if there is that possibility, whether how you can address and as well as address that conflict of interest, as well as be transparent in terms of declaring that, so that no one is then able to in the future question and say that there was potentially, for example, an attempt made to hide a conflict of interest. So, that level of transparency is very important. Now, here is another example of how this operates, the issue of conflict of interest with at the level of an academic research with ties to industry. So, in 1999, a famous case happened. Jesse Gelsinger was a young 18-year-old who had a genetic disorder called ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency. He underwent gene therapy at the University of Pennsylvania and was injected with an adenovirus carrying gene for this condition, which was developed by a company called Genovo. Now, unfortunately, Jesse developed serious problems and actually died within 4 days of undergoing this gene therapy. Later, it was found that actually there had been some safety concerns with this therapy. 2 rhesus monkeys on which earlier research had happened with this therapy had died in similar tests. 4 other human patients who had also undergone preliminary testing with this gene therapy had actually suffered toxicity to their acute toxicity to their livers earlier in the study. And it was also discovered that the principal investigator as well as the head of the institution actually had significant shares in the company sponsoring the product. And this became a major controversy because obviously a lot of this information was actually not known. It was only later on investigations that this was disclosed, and that led to a lot of hue and cry. And the concern there again was that the conflicts of interest which existed with regards to the leadership having shareholding in the company might have actually influenced the decision to go ahead with the therapy when there was a possibility that there were major safety concerns with the therapy, and this kind of a trial should not have happened without further research, or potentially should not have happened because the therapy was not safe enough. So that is a good example of why we need to worry about some of these areas. Now, at the level of the institution as well, we talked about the fact earlier that that's another place or another platform where there might be a conflict of interest which might impact ethics committee functioning. As I said earlier, there might be an institutional stake in grants coming to the institution. Your institution might want more and more money to come to the institution. Sometimes there are indirect factors. For example, increasingly we are seeing in many institutions that salaries are actually drawn from research projects, and there is no other way of paying salaries for many staff within the institution. So the senior leadership in the institution always has this pressure on them to get more and more grants, because that is the only way they can sustain many of their staff members. Now that is an indirect reason for many of them obviously wanting to get more and more grant money, and that could influence them in perhaps on some occasions actually allowing some research to happen which is probably not technically okay, or has some flaws, or might have some safety issues, or might have some ethical concerns. So that is an example where an institutional conflict of interest could impact decision with regards to a particular research protocol. That might also impact the ethics committee, because the ethics committee members, especially those who are internal to the institution, might face pressures from institutional leadership to approve research activities in which the institution has a clear financial stake. And financial stakes can be high, because as you all know, there are significant overheads which the institution also stands to gain from research projects, especially larger research projects. Now, conflicts of interest could also occur at the level of the sponsors. That's the fourth category we spoke about earlier. Now, in some scenarios, researchers might receive money directly from sponsors, yet the expectation is that they would be objective in conducting the research with regards to the sponsor funded research, where there might be a possibility that the sponsor stands to gain majorly financially from the success of that research project, or proof that there is an efficacy of a molecule that they are introducing and wanting to check the efficacy of through the research project. An example is when sponsors pay a finder's fee to doctors who might also be individual investigators or site investigators for each patient that they recruit for the research. And that finder's fee could be high enough that it influences the individual site investigator to do more and more recruitment, even if the potential participant is not the right fit for that clinical study or biomedical study. And that is an example where the sponsor's pressures or the sponsor's payment to that individual clinician who is a site investigator might actually drive them to go in and do go procedures or recruit people who might not be the right fit for doing quality research. Now you could address that by having regulations which preclude this kind of payment being given, or having institutional policies which prevent such sponsor payments being given. In some jurisdictions, they actually have rules which prohibit such practices. But where possible, obviously it should be prohibited, but if otherwise, you should also be transparent about any such arrangements which exist. These should be disclosed, these should be publicly known, including in the research protocol, and also be reflected in the consent form, so that the potential research participant understands that if he or she is recruited into the study, that the clinician or site investigator who is recruiting him into the study or her into the study stands to gain financially from that as well. So it should be clearly transparent and available in the consent form. So that's an example of how you might start to address conflicts of interest. Let's look at other mechanisms which exist in addressing conflicts of interest, because we don't just want to problematize. As I said, sometimes conflicts of interest exist in multiple ways, and it's important to recognize them but also to address them. And let's look at some examples of that. So there are some folks tend to prefer a total prohibition model, which believes that any relationship which presents a conflict of interest should be totally shunned. But other people are much more tend to be more practical, and they believe that it's almost impossible to avoid conflicts of interest all the time, and that it's a better model to actually manage conflicts of interest through disclosure and through peer review. So, David Korn, in an article in JAMA in 2000, spoke about the fact that conflicts of interest are actually now ubiquitous and inevitable in academic life, and actually in any kind of professional life. And the challenge for academic medicine is not to try to eradicate conflicts of interest, because that would be fanciful, but actually to recognize and manage them sensibly and effectively. That was his perspective. So, let us try to see how we can do that, actually manage conflicts of interest. So, at the level of the individual, especially the researcher who might have a potential conflict of interest, it's ideal that in informed consent forms which are given to research participants, you declare the source of funds for researchers, you declare the affiliation of the researcher, you declare if the researcher is getting any sponsor incentive to recruit participants into the study. Where possible, you should be blinding the study, especially at the technical review level, so that any individual who might have a potential conflict of interest is not biased because of that in their decision or in their feedback about that study. Where possible, you can also institute mechanisms for data monitoring or ongoing monitoring of research projects. So, these mechanisms might include, for example, having a data safety and monitoring board or a DSMB for large clinical trials, which can independently look at these trials and ongoing data collection and do an interim analysis to see if there are any trends which are indicative of what's happening in that trial. You might also have mechanisms which forbid that individuals who are looking at these kind of protocols from a review perspective are forbidden from reviewing the work of colleagues. It should always go to an independent third party. And at the level of journals, which is sort of the final frontier before you have publication and then influence of policy, you also ensure that journals have mechanisms where there is independent peer review of manuscripts and they are able to pick up potentially any challenges or any problems with that research study prior to publication. So, at the level of individuals, if you are a researcher who is submitting your research protocol to the ethics committee, you have a responsibility to ensure that you disclose any potential conflicts of interest with regards to you or your team which may affect the research. The ethics committee would then evaluate each study in light of these disclosed interests and ensure that appropriate means of mitigation are taken. So, it is really important that as an ethics committee member or as an ethics committee that you have those mechanisms and that requirement in protocols that individuals and research applicants disclose their conflicts of interest. At the level of the ethics committee, it might also be the case that the sponsor, the investigator, or any other individual who is involved in the conduct of the study should not be participating in the IEC review, except when they are asked to give any specific information with regards to the research protocol. The ethics committee members should be requested or rather required to disclose their potential conflicts of interest as part of even the screening process prior to joining the ethics committee. They should be required to sign confidentiality agreements where they are forbidden from sharing information with regards to the protocols that they review as well as any decisions taken within ethics committee meetings, and also provide conflicts of interest declarations where they lay out any potential conflicts that they might have, for example, with regards to shareholding or having any buy-in from sponsors. For example, if I have a share in a pharma company, then I should be declaring that. In India, what is also expected is that the chair of the ethics committee has to be from outside the institution, cannot be an institutional member or staff, to ensure that the ethics committee leadership has also freedom and is independent, and the head of the institution as well as senior management. So, the director of the institute, the deans of the various parts of the institute should also not be ethics committee members, ethics committee chairs, and ideally not even members as well, to ensure that there is independence of the ethics committee. Now, whenever there is an ethics committee meeting, the individual members should declare their conflicts of interest, and these should be managed in accordance with standard operating procedures, which is why you need to have detailed standard operating procedures which are reflective of that requirement. Ethics committee members as investigators never vote on their own protocols. Typically, members who have conflict of interest should be announcing these conflicts and disqualify themselves from participation with respect to discussion on that protocol, except to provide any information which is asked on request. The minutes of ethics committee meetings should clearly record that the person with the conflict actually left the meeting room and did not participation in any discussions with regard to that protocol, in voting with regard to that protocol, or quorum decision making with regard to that protocol. The members of the ethics committee should also be regularly asked to update information with regards to their potential conflicts of interest, because this might change on a regular basis, because you might invest in stocks every few months. So, obviously your potential conflicts of interest could change. The ethics committee responsibility essentially lies also at the level of the leadership of the ethics committee. The chair or the vice chair, in the absence of the chair, should deal with all of these issues with respect to ethics committee functioning, especially meetings, in terms of listening out and being cognizant of members declaring conflicts of interest and then taking a decision about how to handle that. They should ensure that all members regularly sign conflicts of interest declarations and that these are filed with the secretariat, and members should be required to declare conflicts of interest to the chairperson at the level of every meeting with respect to protocols which are being reviewed during that meeting, and ensure that these are also reflected in the minutes. Now, at the level of the institution, sometimes what helps is actually convening a conflict of interest committee, which is an independent body with participation from a range of external members who have no direct stake in the outcome of the research being conducted at the institution, and that is the decision making body when there is any concern about a potential major conflict of interest which needs to be deliberated and a decision be taken. That is one example of how at the institutional level conflicts of interest could be addressed. But also you need to ensure as an institution that the ethics committee is set up in a manner that within the administrative hierarchy there is enough freedom and enough independence for the ethics committee to be able to function effectively and also address potential conflicts of interest. So, in summary, let's look at very quickly what are the ways to identify, mitigate and manage conflicts of interest. If you are a researcher, you must ensure that all documents you submit to the ethics committee have a disclosure on potential conflicts of interest, either financial or non-financial. You must guard against conflicts of commitment that might arise from situations that place competing demands on your time and loyalties, including that of your team. You must prevent intellectual and personal conflicts by ensuring that you do not serve as a reviewer for grants and publications which are submitted by close colleagues, relatives and or students where there might be a personal bias. At the level of research institutions, it is very important that institutions develop policies and standard operating procedures to address conflicts of interest, and these need to be dynamic, transparent and actively communicated to all stakeholders, including to all staff of the institution. You must implement policies and procedures to address conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment and educate your staff on these on a regular basis. You must have mechanisms to monitor the research or check research results for accuracy and objectivity, especially if there is a possibility of bias. And very importantly, the research institution should not interfere in any way in the independent functioning and decision making of the ethics committee. The ethics committee must evaluate each study in the light of the disclosed conflicts of interest and ensure that appropriate action is taken to mitigate that conflict of interest. The ethics committee must require all members to disclose their own conflicts of interest, take appropriate measures to recuse themselves from reviewing or decision making on protocols where they might have a conflict of interest or where they have declared a conflict of interest, and make appropriate suggestions for management if conflict of interest is detected at the institutional level or at the level of the researchers. I do want to acknowledge some colleagues from whose presentation I have drawn from in preparing this presentation for you. And these are some reading resources for those of you who are further interested in looking at the area of conflicts of interest, which is an important domain for ethics committee members to be familiar about and to know intricately. Thank you very much for your attention.